This is Steve Mosier with the Population Research Institute. I am what is known as a China hand. I have been interested in China for the last 40 years. I was, as it happens, the first American social scientist, that is, someone who studies economics and social questions, allowed into China back in 1979. It was a fascinating experience and led me down the road to understand, I think, in a way that many Americans don't, the nature of communist China, the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, and the kind of rule that it imposes on the Chinese people. It's interesting that Chinese history, 100 years ago, a century ago, could have gone in one of two different directions, because we had two different political parties in China at that time. We don't have two political parties in China now. We just have one. The Chinese Communist Party tolerates no competition. But in the early 1920s, we had two political parties. One was the Nationalist Party, and one was the Chinese Communist Party. The Nationalist Party was modeled on the United States. Its constitution was modeled on the U.S. Constitution. Its principles, three principles of the people, were an effort to move China in not only the direction of economic development, raising living standards, but move in the direction of full democracy over time, respect for human rights, respect for freedoms of speech, assembly, association, and all the rest. And the other political party was the Chinese Communist Party. Now, it promised all the same things. It promised, and it still promises, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. It promises to respect the religious beliefs of the people, to allow them freedom. But in reality, it doesn't, because it's modeled not on a Western liberal democratic vision. It's modeled upon communism as practiced in the former Soviet Union. And that is to say, communism as a one-party dictatorship exerting absolute control over the population, where it goes, what it does, and basically what people think. And of course, that was the party, the Chinese Communist Party, that won the Chinese Civil War and has imposed its rule on China over the last 75 years. Now, you need to understand that the Chinese Communist Party promotes among the people a vision of the future in which the government will fade away, the Chinese Communist Party will cease to exist, and everyone will be absolutely equal. Everyone will be working as hard as they can to produce goods, and everyone will only consume what they need. It sounds like paradise. And that vision of what we might call heaven on earth has been used to deceive literally hundreds of millions of people over the last century. The Chinese Communist Party has been in power for 75 years. It shows no signs of fading away. It shows no signs of allowing the people the kind of freedom to produce and consume that is promised in the communist fantasy of a future world. It shows every sign of exerting more and more control over its own people. The Communist Party continues to grow in number. There are now 94 million members of the Chinese Communist Party in China. 94 million is a pretty big number. Ruling over the 1.4 billion, that's 1,400 million people who live in China. So about 8% of the population, more or less, rules over the other 92% with an iron hand. And so instead of everybody becoming equal, you really see China divided into two societies. One is the society of normal people, the 92%, where more than 9 out of 10 people try to go about their lives making a living, either farming or making things or running a small shop. And then you have the 1 out of 10, actually less than 1 out of 10, who control the economy, control politics, and tolerate no opposition to their rule. Now, what is this tiny minority of 1 in 10 produce? Well, it doesn't produce anything, really. It controls society, and it lives off the production of others. So how much does this 8% of the population take from the Chinese people? Well, we estimate that about a third of everything that's produced in China goes in one way or another to support the Chinese Communist Party. That is to say, if you're a worker in China and you produce $100 worth of goods, a third of that is going to go to support the Chinese Communist Party. Part of that goes to support the party in terms of paying their salaries, paying their housing, paying for their transportation, their limousines, their chauffeured limousines, paying for their travel, domestic travel and international travel, paying for their private resorts in China, scattered throughout China, and paying for their banquets where they eat very well. So that's where your money goes, to this political party that controls the police and controls the military and controls you and basically lives off the efforts of others in a sort of parasitical fashion. So that's the Chinese Communist Party today. It shows no sign of fading away at all. And the other thing the Chinese Communist Party has done over the last 75 years is rule by fear, rule by force and the threat of force. You see, the Chinese Communist Party has, from the beginning of taking over China in 1949, purged one group after another, targeted one group after another for punishment. In the beginning, they targeted all the members of the Nationalist Party, the party that they had defeated in the Chinese Civil War. They then targeted people they call capitalists, people who had started their own business, people that I call wealth creators, who had started their own business and were improving lives for themselves and their families and hiring other people, giving other people work and enabling them to support their families. Capitalists were targeted and their businesses were confiscated by the government, taken over, expropriated. Then they targeted people who owned land. These weren't huge landowners. They didn't have huge estates. The landlords, the rich peasants in China, were people who owned a little more land than they could farm themselves and leased it out to others to farm in their stead. They were targeted, punished, arrested. Many were killed. And then the land was given to all the people equally. But that land distribution only lasted for a few years. And by the mid-1950s, the government, the Chinese Communist Party, took the land back from villagers and established huge people's communes, which were run by Communist Party officials. Now, when I say huge people's communes, I mean these communes sometimes had 50,000, 60,000, 70,000, 80,000 people. 80,000 was the population of the commune that I lived in 1979 and 1980. A huge collective farm where everyone was supposed to work very hard in the fields for the common good. It was supposed to be, again, communism come to life, where everyone worked as hard as they could to produce goods and everyone only consumed what they needed. As you can imagine, this led to absolute disaster because people in the common fields worked as little as they could and they kept what they could for their own families to survive. The commune system failed in the early 1960s, and it failed. It died not with whimper, but with a famine. 45 million Chinese died in the famine in China from 1960 to 1962. Why? Because the Chinese Communist Party, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao had decided they were going to achieve rural communism overnight. And as communism always does, it failed. and it failed at the cost of 45 million lives of people who starved to death. So the Chinese Communist Party continues to rule China today, 75 years later, with an iron hand. But China has, as you might imagine, serious difficulties right now. It has serious difficulties because the Chinese Communist Party has overbuilt apartments and stores in China, pouring concrete by the millions of tons throughout the country. They have now in China 65 million homes that are vacant, and real estate prices have collapsed. Tens of millions of Chinese have put down their life savings for an apartment in a high-rise building that will never be completed. You have to pay for the apartment in China before they build it. And the companies that took their money, which are run in effect by the Chinese Communist Party, have spent their money and not finished the apartment building. So these apartment buildings are simply empty shells. The youth unemployment rate, the young people from 16 to 25, is about 16% officially. I think the real unemployment rate is about 50%. That is, 1 out of 2 young people in China are unemployed right now and unable to find work, unable to support themselves, still living with their families. People in China who did manage to make some money and keep it away from the Chinese Communist Party are fleeing China as quickly as they can get out the door and taking as much of their wealth with them as they can. That's why we have, over the last 12 months, I think, have 37,000 illegal Chinese immigrants coming across the southern border. Now, these are people who are fleeing China because the economy of China is collapsing. The reason for this is that the Chinese Communist Party has now once again begun moving down the road to full socialism, where the Chinese Communist Party owns everything and controls the people with an iron hand. The reasons are simple. The Chinese leader, the new leader, Xi Jinping, is a committed communist. He once again wants to take China down the socialist road to ruin. He wants the Chinese Communist Party to control everything. Over the last few decades, some private companies have flourished in China, mostly making goods for export to the United States and other Western countries. That's why when you go in a big box store like Target or Walmart, you'll see the shelves filled with goods that come from China. These were produced by Chinese workers, often in factories that were started by Chinese entrepreneurs, wealth creators, a few decades ago. Xi Jinping, like Mao Zedong before him, has decided that those private companies need to come under state control. And so he's seized control of private companies in China, which exist in name only. And once the government comes in, once the Chinese Communist Party comes in, again, party officials don't create anything, they simply consume. The company will then gradually lose focus and eventually go bankrupt, require subsidies from the state to continue in operation. That's what's happening all over China. The other thing that's happening in China is the population is aging and dying. You know, I mentioned that the Chinese Communist Party always has to have an enemy to focus the attention of the Chinese people away from the Chinese Communist Party, which is their real enemy, to some other group. And in the early days, it was the nationalists or the capitalists or the landlords, the rich peasants. But in these latter days, the target for many, many decades was unborn children. The Chinese Communist Party decided in 1980, when I was in China, to embark on a one-child policy, to limit everyone in the country to one child. And they did this, why? Well, they did this in part because they had come to believe in the myth of overpopulation, that there were too many people on the planet, there were too many people in China, and if China wanted to develop, it needed to drastically reduce its population. And so they told every couple, you can only have one child. Now, that is a way to reduce your population, obviously. If every two people only have one child, you're going to cut the population in half from one generation to another. So population control was instituted in China for almost 40 years. And couples, generation after generation, were told they were only allowed one child. So population growth stalled in China. And over the course of 36, 37 years, some 400 million unborn and newborn children were eliminated, killed, taken out of the Chinese population. And what effect did that have? Well, it has resulted in the aging and the dying of the Chinese population. The aging is obvious. I mean, if you eliminate 400 million children from your population, the population that's left is going to be older and aging rapidly. And that's what's happened in China. Dying, what I mean by that is the Chinese population is now shrinking. It is actually, they're actually digging more graves than filling cradles these days in China. They're filling more caskets than cradles. More people are dying in China than are being born in China. So not only do you have a 94 million member strong Chinese Communist Party that produces nothing but lives off the production, the hard work, and enterprise of others. Not only do you have a communist leader, Xi Jinping, who is committed to taking China down the socialist road once again and letting the party run everything literally into the ground. You have a population that, because of the one-child policy, is actually shrinking and dying. And those three things have created a kind of perfect storm in China, which is headed, I think, over the next few years to economic collapse. Why did China target the unborn for 36 years? Again, because the Chinese Communist Party always needs an enemy to focus the anger of the people toward their circumstances away from the party, which is the actual cause of their problems, towards another group. And so, as in the early years, they blamed the capitalists and the landlords for hindering China's development. For almost 4 decades, they blamed unborn children. Unborn children were declared to be, in effect, enemies of the state. We can't develop our country for the good of the country, for the good of the communes, for the good of the Chinese Communist Party, for the good of the Chinese people. We must eliminate unborn children. So they were enemies of the state, and they were targeted and killed for almost 4 decades. The end result is a China that is now in economic crises. That poses a danger, not just to the Chinese people, unfortunately, but to the world at large. China is under the new Red Emperor, the new head of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, is building up the largest military that the world has ever seen. It continues to build ships, planes, and tanks, and drones and other modern weapons at a pace that no other country can come close to matching. So what will happen in the future as China faces internal economic collapse because of the continued move towards full socialism, the continued destruction of the wealth creators in China, and of course the fact that China's population is dying? Will Xi Jinping embark on a foreign adventure? Will Xi Jinping keep his promise to take back Taiwan, a free and independent country that has never been under the control of the Chinese Communist Party? Will he, before 2025, next year, or 2027, we've heard 2 dates, move militarily to take back the island of Taiwan by brute force? Will he move against other countries around the South China Sea, like the Philippines, for example, a U.S. ally? Will he move against Japan in the future years? We don't know. We do know that Xi Jinping's best friend internationally is Vladimir Putin, the dictator of Russia, who's currently at war against Ukraine. We do know that Iran's best friend internationally is China, and Iran is currently, of course, both directly and indirectly through Hamas terrorism and supporting Hezbollah terrorism in Lebanon, creating chaos in the Middle East. We do know that if you look at any country run by a dictator, such as Cuba or Venezuela by the dictator Maduro, you will find that their best friend internationally, the one sending them arms, military arms, and providing financial support and support in international organizations like the United Nations, their best friend is always the Chinese Communist Party's leader, Xi Jinping, and Communist China itself. China has in mind to create a very different world than the one that we have lived in since World War II. Since World War II, the efforts of the United States have been devoted to try to spread freedom and democracy around the world. We, under President Reagan, back in the 1980s, built up the U.S. military, prevented technology from being transferred to the former Soviet Union, and prevented financial aid from going to the Soviet Union, so that at the end of the day, by 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And all of the captive nations in Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, of course, the former Yugoslavia, all won their freedom. And they continue to enjoy that freedom to this day. The world that we live in, however, now seems to be headed back to the past because China has formed an alliance, a pseudo-alliance, of their best friends now between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They have signed a number of agreements pledging to work together. And their effort will, I think, is directed towards creating a very different world than the one we live in now. If they succeed, the world that they create will be a very different and darker place. Freedom will be extinguished, perhaps forever, by this new alliance between China and Russia. At the end of the day, of course, the two systems that we have, the Western system of democracy with regular elections, with competing political parties, with the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, with respect for human rights, with respect to the fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of association, so that you can form political parties and form labor unions, for example, freedom of assembly, so that you can peacefully protest abuses by your government, and freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, so you're free to believe what you choose to believe. That is now in competition with a very different and darker vision of the world of the future, where the Chinese Communist Party, or in Putin's Russia, Putin himself will dictate what you think, what you believe, where you go, how you live, how you spend your money, and so forth. So we find ourselves in interesting times, and we need to, all of us, understand that the nature of China, the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, and the kind of future that it wants to impose, not just on the Chinese people, who are its first and foremost victims, but on the people of the world. And let me close by saying this. There are clear signs that the Chinese Communist Party itself understands that it is perpetrating a fraud on the Chinese people. And I say that because about 10 years ago, after the new Chinese dictator, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, took power, they published a secret document only given to the senior members of the Chinese Communist Party, which listed the 7 deadly perils to the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party. These 7 deadly perils were threats to the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And some of these threats to the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party, you will understand instantly, because they're things like the rule of law. Obviously, if you have the rule of law, then a one-party dictatorship cannot coexist with the true rule of law because it will lose its power. Representative democracy is another mortal threat to the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Because remember, no Communist Party has won a truly fair and free election ever in human history. If you allow people to vote, they will vote the Communist Party out of power. That's why Communist parties never allow a free and open vote. Do not think for 1 minute that the 92% of the Chinese population that is not in the Chinese Communist Party would instantly vote the 8% of the population that represents the Chinese Communist Party out of power if they were given the opportunity. So they won't be given the opportunity. But there are 2 mortal perils here that really reveal the fraud that is the Chinese Communist Party and really communism itself. Because the 2 mortal perils that I want to bring up and highlight are these. An accurate accounting of the history of the Chinese Communist Party is listed as a mortal peril to the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And an accurate accounting of the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party is listed as another deadly threat to the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, why would an accurate account of the history and the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party threaten their rule? Well, because the history of the Chinese Communist Party is really a history of one bloody purge and persecution after another. We've talked about some of those. We talked about the purge of the nationalists, the capitalists, the wealth creators, the landlords, people who opposed Communist Party rule, the Cultural Revolution, people who promoted freedom of speech. They were all arrested. People in the churches of China, Catholics and Protestants alike, were arrested and punished. And of course, for a long time, the unborn children were declared to be the enemies of the state. So an accurate accounting of this history, this bloody history, this history of purges, this history in which the Chinese Communist Party has arguably killed 100 million Chinese. And if you add to that the 400 million victims of the little victims of the one-child policy, the Chinese Communist Party has killed more human beings than any political organization in human history. 500 million people is the death toll that I come up with. An accurate accounting of that history would absolutely discredit the Chinese Communist Party. And so they hide that history. And they say that anyone who accurately tells the history of the Chinese Communist Party is threatening communist rule. What about the ideology? Well, we talked about the ideology, right? The fantasy that one day the government is going to fade away, the Chinese Communist Party will cease to exist, and everyone will be equal. Everyone will be producing and consuming without the need for any government surveillance or oversight or control altogether. Well, that too is a fantasy. That too is never going to happen. The government in China, the Chinese Communist Party, hasn't gotten weaker over time. It's using modern technology to grow ever stronger. So obviously an accurate account of the ideology of China, an accurate account of the ideology of China would show just this, that the ideology, the communist ideology, is a fantasy. The government is never going to fade away. The Chinese Communist Party is never going to relax its control over the Chinese people. It's always going to need to be terrorizing one group or another to keep the Chinese people in individual cells of fear, to keep them quiet, to keep them from resisting, rebelling, and overthrowing the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. So you see, the Chinese Communist Party admits itself that its history is one of devastation and purges and death, and its ideology that it used to deceive the Chinese people and seize power back 75 years ago is also a fantasy a fabrication, and a deceit. So what will happen in the future? Well, um, the dead hand of the state is crushing the wealth creators in China, crushing the economy of China. Yet at the same time, it's engaging in a massive, massive military buildup and threatening its neighbors, and through its alliance with the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, now Russia, is threatening wider parts of the world. We find ourselves in perilous times, and I think it is incumbent upon all of us to recognize the danger that the Chinese Communist Party and communism in general poses to not only the Chinese people, but the world at large. Thank you very much for listening today, and I hope to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Moser, for being here with us today and for giving part 2 of your China lecture. We have previous lectures on China under Mao, and so China Today is a great lecture that sheds light upon what China has experienced under communism since Mao. One question for students that might hear that communism hasn't been properly tried, or traits of communism can be used in different countries, picking and choosing maybe what works best for a certain country. What would you say to students that hear that argument, and how would you suggest that they counter that argument?
Well, I think that there are basically 2 different ways of organizing society. You can organize society based on the principle of individual freedom, economic freedom, and political freedom. Freedom to choose where you live and what you believe and what kind of society you want to perform. And the opposite, where a small group of individuals who perhaps think of themselves as an elite and believe that they can control your lives better than you can, seize power. And that's what communism basically is. It's a very elitist view of how to organize society. Karl Marx and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and Joseph Stalin, of course, always thought, and Mao himself always thought, that he could make better decisions for the Chinese people than they could make for themselves, that he alone could decide how people should live. And among the things that Mao did, of course, was he attempted to completely dissolve society and make everyone loyal to and beholden to the state, and dissolve all of the intermediate associations in society. Labor unions were not allowed to exist. Churches were dissolved. Families, and even families, the fundamental unit of society, were dissolved by Mao. At least he tried to, by separating men and women, putting them in different dormitories, and raising the children in state-run daycare centers. So that was an effort to completely demolish society, including the family, and make everyone into minions of the state. And I think that's where communism always leads. It leads to a system of total control. And there's no guarantee that once you cede power to a small communist elite, that they will ever stop their effort to expand their control. Why would they? Because they've eliminated all competing groups in society. They've eliminated all possible centers of resistance. They've eliminated competing political parties. They've eliminated the people's right to keep and bear arms. And remember, the first thing that all communist parties do when they seize power is immediately collect all the weapons from the people, making it impossible for them to engage in armed resistance against the controls that are being imposed upon them. In fact, in the early days of the Chinese Communist Party's rule in China, it is a capital offense to own a weapon. So if you were found to have hidden a pistol or a rifle in communist China, you would be executed, summarily executed. They simply did not allow individuals to own guns. As Chairman Mao famously said, political power grows from the barrel of a gun. And he also said that only the party should be allowed to control guns. So this is really a one-way street. And once you start down this road, the socialist road to ruin, I call it, you end up living under a one-party dictatorship, a tyranny, and giving up your rights for a long time, if not forever.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you for being with us today. And for all those watching, we have the Victims of Communism Museum in Washington, D.C., as well as our website with lots of different resources. Mr. Mosier has participated in lots of our educational efforts in the past, so you can find more information about him and all of our other speakers on our website. Thank you again for being here today. Thanks to all who are watching. Have a great rest of your day.